Imagine the most powerful military force the world has ever seen. A nation that spends more on defense than the next 10 countries combined. That operates 11 carrier battle groups. That maintains bases across the globe. Now imagine that this same force, on the day it would need to fight most, discovered it couldn't sustain the fight for more than 3 weeks. Not because it was defeated in battle, not because the enemy proved superior in the field, but because it ran out of ammunition. This is not science fiction, and it's not a future threat. Right now, as you watch this video, auditors from the American government itself have documents confirming that this vulnerability already exists. Not in 2027, now. It's documented in reports from the Inspector General of the Department of Defense, in audits from the U.S. Government Accountability Office, in war simulations conducted by the Center for Strategic and International Studies, in testimony from 4-star admirals before committees of the United States Congress. And the date that makes all this urgent is 2027. Stay until the end of this video, because what you'll understand here fundamentally changes how you read every headline about Taiwan. The most disturbing part is not what China can do. It's what the United States itself has already admitted, in public documents, that it cannot do. Most people consuming news about Taiwan focus on the wrong question. This video is about the question that conventional coverage constantly ignores. In March 2023, Admiral John Aquilino, then commander of U.S. Indo-Pacific Command, the highest-ranking officer responsible for military defense of the Pacific, testified before the Senate Armed Services Committee, and he said, in words recorded in the Senate's historical record, China can act against Taiwan before 2027. And when he identified the critical point of American vulnerability, he didn't talk about fifth-generation fighters. He didn't talk about the number of carriers. He talked about logistics. Daily coverage of Taiwan usually treats 2027 only as a future threat, something that may or may not happen, depending exclusively on Beijing's choices. What these analyses consistently ignore is that American vulnerability, the structural flaw that would make that year so catastrophic, is not in the future. It already exists in the present and has been exhaustively documented by Washington's oversight agencies. We're going to open 2 loops today. First, what exactly is this logistical problem and why is it so critical? Second, how do we know it's as serious as it seems? The answer to the second question will surprise you, because those who said it was serious weren't external critics. It was the American government in its official reports, with its own numbers. Let's start at the center. What Aquilino called a critical gap is not a minor technical detail. It is the strategic center of gravity of any conflict in the Pacific. And to understand why, we need to go a little deeper than headlines usually do. Before diving into the numbers and reports, we need to establish a principle that determined the outcome of all the great naval wars in modern history. In oceanic conflicts, whoever controls the supply line controls the outcome. This is not an academic observation. It is the most costly and most repeated lesson from 20th century military history. And what Pentagon planners know, what was revealed in internal assessments that have only now come public, is that the United States has lost that logistical advantage. Not on the battlefield, in the warehouses, in fuel storage depots, in containers that should be full and aren't. To understand how this is possible for the militarily most powerful nation in history, we need to understand the principle that decided all the great naval wars of the last century. In World War II in the Pacific, distance was the decisive variable. From the west coast of the United States to the Solomon Islands was more than 10,000 kilometers of ocean. Every barrel of fuel, every torpedo, every spare part for an airplane engine, every unit of canned food for a crew member, Everything had to cross that ocean before any soldier, sailor, or aviator could operationalize any combat capability. Japan was not defeated simply because its soldiers fought poorly. It was defeated, in a fundamental sense, because the United States mastered the art of maintaining supply lines operating at unimaginable distances, and simultaneously destroyed Japanese supply lines, sinking cargo ships, blockading routes, isolating garrisons. Today, in a Taiwan conflict, the distances are of the same order of magnitude. From the most advanced bases, in Guam, Okinawa, Japan, to the Taiwan theater of operations is 1,500 to 4,000 kilometers of ocean. From American continental territory, there are tens of thousands of kilometers that any strategic resupply would need to cross. Every precision missile for an American destroyer, every spare component for an F-35, every ton of aviation fuel for sustained operations needs to reach advanced bases in the Pacific before it can be consumed in combat. And here is what makes the Taiwan conflict fundamentally different from almost every conflict the United States has been involved in over the past decades. The adversary profoundly understands this logistical principle. More than that, it has built its entire military strategy around exploiting this dependency. What China has understood, and this is the central insight that redefines analysis of a possible Pacific conflict, is that it doesn't need to defeat the American Navy in open naval battle. Directly confronting American carrier strike groups would be enormously costly and uncertain in outcome. There is a more efficient approach, more asymmetric, and potentially more decisive, to render the American Navy unable to resupply, rearm, and sustain itself. Isolate forward bases, cut supply lines, create a situation in which the United States simply runs out of what it needs to continue fighting. It's not the strategy of winning a battle. It's the strategy of ensuring that the adversary cannot remain on the battlefield long enough for the battle to be decided. And this completely changes the nature of the problem that American planners need to solve. Because now the question is not who has the most accurate missile or the quietest submarine at the opening of the conflict. The question is, when the conflict begins, who can sustain combat for longer? And if American stockpiles of long-range precision munitions run out in the first week, and there is rigorous simulation that concluded exactly that, then the answer to the sustainability question is determined before the first shot is fired. But what exactly has China built to break the American logistical chain? Let's examine the specific systems. In mid-2015, satellite imagery confirmed what defense analysts had suspected for years. China had operationally deployed the DF-26, a medium-range ballistic missile with an estimated range of approximately 4,000 kilometers. The nickname the missile quickly gained in American strategic vocabulary was Guam Killer. This nickname is not dramatic journalism. It is the design specification. Guam sits approximately 3,000 kilometers from China's continental coast. The DF-26 was designed to strike fixed targets of logistical infrastructure, fuel depots, ammunition warehouses, hangars, port infrastructure, and naval platforms. The distance between the launcher in Chinese territory and the primary American logistical base in the Western Pacific is comfortably within the system's operational range. What this means in strategic terms is that Guam can be attacked from Chinese continental territory without a single Chinese aircraft, ship, or soldier needing to cross thousands of kilometers of ocean to do so. But the DF-26 is just one instrument of a much broader threat architecture. The DF-21D is an anti-ship ballistic missile designed specifically to strike moving aircraft carriers and large naval platforms, something Western analysts have called a carrier killer. While the DF-26 threatens the fixed bases that store supplies, The DF-21D threatens the ships that would try to bring new supplies close to the battlefield. They are two layers of the same problem. You cannot use what you have in Guam because Guam is under attack, and you cannot bring what you don't have because resupply ships are being threatened at sea. Now dive below the surface. The People's Liberation Army Navy has expanded its submarine fleet at a pace that has concerned American planners for more than a decade, including units equipped with long-range cruise missiles capable of threatening both surface ships and the maritime lines of communication that cross the Pacific. In February 2024, the House Select Committee on the Chinese Communist Party published a report in language that leaves no room for alternative interpretation. American bases in the Pacific are within range of Chinese missile systems, and American supply chains are defenseless against an opening conflict attack. This was not a report from a think tank critical of the Washington establishment. It was the United States Congress itself detailing the vulnerability in explicit and public language. What China has built is a system of access denial and area denial, known by the acronym A2DIRT Anno Domini, specifically architected to isolate American forward bases before the United States can respond effectively. The DF-26 strikes fuel and ammunition depots. The DF-21D intercepts resupply ships and high-value naval platforms. Submarines compromise maritime supply routes. And all of this happens in the first hours of the conflict, before Washington can mobilize a coordinated response. The question this architecture poses is direct. Are American bases in the Pacific really as vulnerable as the threat suggests? The answer, confirmed in official documentation, is yes. Let's talk about concrete geography. Guam is the central hub of American advanced logistics in the Western Pacific. Andersen Air Force Base and Naval Base Guam concentrate fuel, munitions, pre-positioned stocks, and maintenance capacity that would be critical in the first days of any Taiwan contingency. And they are in a single geographic point. This concentration is not a meaningless historical accident. It was a rational strategic choice for an era when the Pacific was, in fact, an American lake, when there was no threat of medium-range ballistic missiles capable of reaching Guam from Chinese territory, when the American Navy operated in an environment of unrestricted access. In that context, centralizing resources in an efficient node made perfect logistical and economic sense. But the strategic environment has changed radically in the last 2 decades. The concentration remained. In April 2024, the Heritage Foundation Index, one of the reference publications for analyzing American military readiness, assessed the logistical readiness of the United States in the Pacific with a classification of weak. The specific findings are revealing in their level of detail. Fuel storage concentrated in Guam, not geographically dispersed. Non-hardened infrastructure. Lack of adequate bunkers to protect ammunition and aircraft from missile attacks. Insufficient support ships and pre-positioning for the needs of a high-intensity contingency. The Heritage Foundation was not alone. Far from it. The Inspector General of the Department of Defense and the Office of Government Accountability, the GAO, conducted independent audits between 2023 and 2024, based on direct access to classified Pentagon data. The converging conclusion: the war reserve stocks in Guam and the bases in Japan are below the required levels in fuel, ammunition, and spare parts, below the levels that the Pentagon's own operational plans establish as necessary. This closes the second question we established at the beginning of this video. How do we know that the situation is as serious as we claim? It's not in a political opposition analysis. It's not in a think tank report with an ideological agenda. It is in documents produced by the American government's own auditors, the same auditors that the Pentagon is legally required to allow in. When the Inspector General of the Department of Defense says below the required levels, He is saying one thing with surgical precision. If the existing plans were executed tomorrow, the stocks would not suffice. It's not a projection, it's a shelf check. And the shelf is empty in the places that matter most. Now, let's expand the map. Okinawa and the other American bases on mainland Japan are even closer to China, within the first and second island chains, within the range not only of the DF-26, but of shorter-range missile systems, and in much greater numbers. These bases offer advanced operational capacity and valuable geographic positioning, but at the cost of maximum exposure to conventional attacks from the first hours of any conflict. Now, knowing that stocks are insufficient is different from knowing what happens operationally when the conflict actually begins. To understand this with precision, we need to examine the only comprehensive simulation that brought all these variables together in a realistic scenario. In January 2023, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, the CSIS, published the results of an extensive war game titled First Battle of the Next War. The methodology was rigorous. Participants included senior former American military officers, defense experts with decades of experience in Pacific planning, and analysts with access to government data. The modeled scenario was a Chinese amphibious invasion of Taiwan, with American forces responding with full capacity within current operational planning parameters. The central finding is the type of conclusion that should have dominated weeks of headlines in any serious news outlet covering national security. The United States' long-range precision ammunition, the types of weapons that allow attacking targets at sea and in contested territory without putting launching platforms at immediate risk, were exhausted within the first week of conflict. Week 1, not week 4, not after a month of intense combat, within the first 7 days. What this means operationally deserves to be made explicit. The American doctrinal model in the last 3 decades has been built around long-distance precision capability. The central idea is that the United States can project power efficiently because its weapon systems are precise enough to hit critical targets at great distance, keeping expensive platforms like aircraft carriers and destroyers out of the range of enemy defenses. This doctrine is the foundation of modern American military superiority. But long-distance precision has a cost. The missiles are expensive, complex to manufacture, and stocks are finite. In a high-intensity conflict against an adversary with substantial defense systems and attack capability, as China certainly possesses, the consumption of precision ammunition is extraordinarily rapid. The CSIS concluded that, in the Taiwan scenario, this consumption exceeds the available stocks within the first week. After that week, what remained? Much more limited combat capabilities, because the systems that make American forces effective at safe distance no longer have anything to fire. Shortly after the publication of the CSIS report, an internal Pentagon working group, known as the Tiger Team, conducted its own internal review of logistical sustainment capabilities. The report, referenced in 2024 by outlets such as Reuters and Defense One, based on sources within the Department of Defense, reached a complementary and equally alarming conclusion. Without resupply from American continental territory, U.S. forces cannot sustain combat beyond 3 to 4 weeks. 3 to 4 weeks. Not months of combat. Not the time needed for international diplomacy to function, for allies to organize coordinated responses, for economic and political pressure on Beijing to take effect. 3 to 4 weeks. And resupply from American continental territory. What military planners call CONUS, Continental United States, does not happen in days. The mobilization of the American industrial base, the prioritization of specific ammunition production, the preparation of military and commercial transport ships, the loading of strategic cargo, the transit across the Pacific. This process takes weeks. In the scenario modeled by the Tiger team, when forward forces reach their operational sustainment limit, the resupply process would barely have completed its initial mobilization phase. The combination of these two findings, CSIS and Tiger team, defines what analysts came to call the arithmetic of defeat. It is not a pessimistic projection from analysts with ideological positions. It is operational arithmetic validated by entities at the heart of American defense. A respected think tank with access to former high-ranking officers and an internal Pentagon working group. And the American Congress read that arithmetic. In 2025, the National Defense Authorization Act, the NDAA 2025, included an explicit requirement that the Department of Defense formally report ammunition stockpile levels in the Pacific. When Congress needs to legislate to force the Pentagon to report its own stockpile levels, it is because members of defense committees already know, from behind closed-door briefings and testimony, what the numbers will show, and are creating a formal public record. But even if stockpiles were adequate at the beginning of the conflict, which we documented are not, there would still remain an equally serious structural problem. And that problem is what makes the testimony of Admiral Paparo so significant. In March 2024, Admiral Samuel Paparo, who had assumed command of Indopacom from Aquilino, testified before the U.S. Congress. Paparo is the four-star officer responsible for planning and, if necessary, executing American military defense in the Pacific. If there is one man whose words about logistical capacity in the Pacific should be taken with utmost seriousness, it is the commander responsible for the plans that depend on that capacity. And the words he used were direct. The maritime and air transport capacity for a Taiwan contingency is dangerously inadequate. Not can be improved with additional investment. Not we are working to strengthen this capacity. Dangerously inadequate. Those are the exact words of a four-star officer in public testimony to the U.S. Congress, describing the resupply capacity on which his combat plans depend. Why is resupply so difficult under conditions of active conflict in the Pacific? Because the Pacific that the United States would need to cross with military cargo ships and strategic transport aircraft would no longer be the Pacific of 1944, dominated by American aviation, with sea lanes of communication essentially secure beyond a certain point. It would be a Pacific where submarines of the People's Liberation Army Navy operate along the same sea routes that resupply ships would need to follow, where the range of the DF-21D covers vast areas of the Western Pacific that any support ship would need to cross to reach forward bases, where air corridors to Guam and Okinawa pass through air denial zones created by long-range air defense systems. The central point that Paparo's testimony exposes is structural. The American logistical architecture was designed to operate in an environment of unrestricted access. The Pacific is no longer an environment of unrestricted access. That is the gap between the model the United States built and the environment China has created over the past 2 decades. And that gap is not theoretical. It is operational, and was described in those terms by the highest-ranking American official responsible for the theater in question. Resupply ships become targets. Air corridors become contested zones. Forward bases that already have inadequate stocks become besieged before additional supplies can arrive. The problem is not merely that stockpiles are insufficient at the beginning of conflict. It is that the resupply mechanism fails precisely under the conditions when it would be needed. A supply chain that only functions when it is not under pressure is not a supply chain for the war China plans to wage. And now the question that any honest analyst must ask. The Pentagon must know all of this. What is being done to solve the problem? The honest answer is, there is a plan. The plan has a name, it has a coherent operational concept, and it has received increasing attention at the highest levels of the Department of Defense. The problem is not the absence of a solution. The problem is the timeline. The concept is called Distributed Maritime Operations, or DMO. The central idea is to disperse forces and logistics across multiple smaller nodes distributed throughout the Pacific, rather than concentrating them in major hubs like Guam and Japanese bases. Instead of a small number of high-value, highly concentrated targets, exactly what the DF-26 was designed to destroy, the United States would create dozens of smaller support points in distributed locations, each individually harder to eliminate with ballistic missile attacks. The logic is that if you can't harden them sufficiently to withstand an attack, distribute them enough that no single attack can eliminate them all. On paper, it's exactly what American doctrine needed to build a decade ago. The problem is that the blueprint and the calendar aren't talking to each other. In early 2025, the Department of Defense announced it was accelerating DMO implementation as a strategic priority. But hardening infrastructure takes years. Building adequate facilities, creating distributed and protected fuel storage systems, establishing ammunition depots in multiple locations with corresponding maintenance logistics, developing trained personnel to operate those distributed nodes. Specialized publications like Defense News and Breaking Defense have consistently reported that DMO implementation is years away from operational readiness. Years away. And the date Aquilino entered into the record of the American Senate is 2027. The gap between these two timelines is the core of the problem this video exposes. China has a target date toward which all its military modernization is directed. The United States has a logistical solution whose implementation timeline doesn't converge with that date. The vulnerability window is not a metaphor. It's a quantifiable time interval between an identified risk and a response capability that doesn't yet exist. The United States is not ignoring the problem. Aquilino named it. Paparo confirmed it. CSIS quantified it. The Tiger team documented it internally. Congress legislated it. The DoD-IG and GAO audited it. And the Department of Defense has a plan to fix it. But the plan and the threat aren't on the same timeline. And when I say this gap has consequences that go far beyond the battlefield, I'm not talking about hypothetical consequences. I'm talking about a calculable collapse of deterrence. The mechanism that, until now, has prevented the conflict from beginning. That's what we're going to examine now. Let's bring it all together in a conclusion that synthesizes public records. Not speculation, not controversial analysis, not alarmist projection. The chain of American logistical vulnerability in the Pacific has 4 links, each independently confirmed by distinct sources. First, geography. America's main advanced logistics depots are concentrated in Guam and Japanese bases, all within the demonstrated range of Chinese missile systems. This is confirmed by the House Select Committee on the Chinese Communist Party in a February 2024 report, with explicit language about supply chains defenseless in an opening attack. Second, stockpiles. War reserve levels in Guam and Japan are below the levels required by the Pentagon's own operational plans for fuel, ammunition, and spare parts, confirmed by the Department of Defense Inspector General and the GAO in independent audits published between 2023 and 2024. Third, sustained combat capability. In a January 2023 CSIS simulation, American long-range precision munitions were exhausted in the first week of a Taiwan conflict. The Pentagon's Tiger team was equally direct. Without resupply from the continental U.S., maximum sustainment is 3 to 4 weeks. After that, operational collapse. Fourth, resupply. Admiral Paparo, in testimony to Congress in March 2024, declared the maritime and airlift capacity to Taiwan dangerously insufficient. The resupply routes cross exactly the maritime space that Chinese submarines and anti-ship missiles were built to contest. 4 links. 4 independent confirmations. Each from a different source, with a different methodology, with no coordination between them, and arriving at the same conclusion. When independent government auditors, think tanks with access to retired generals, internal Pentagon working groups, and commanders testifying to Congress say the same thing without consulting each other, it's not alarmism, it's convergence. What is the strategic implication of this beyond the battlefield? Deterrence works when the adversary believes the cost of acting exceeds the expected benefit. For American deterrence to work in the Pacific regarding Taiwan, China would need to calculate that the United States can sustain a conflict long enough to make the cost of invasion unacceptably high. If Beijing has read the same reports from the DoDIG, GAO, CSIS, and House Committee that are publicly available, and there's every reason to believe Chinese intelligence has access to far more than these public documents, then the calculus of deterrence is compromised. The threat of American response is only deterrent if Beijing believes that response can be sustained. Japan, Australia, the Philippines, each anchors its regional defense strategy on the premise that the United States can sustain combat for long enough for the coalition to work. The documents we analyzed put that premise in doubt, and the foreign ministries of Tokyo, Canberra, and Manila have certainly read the same reports. When the American guarantee loses credibility in the documents of the American government itself, each ally's calculation changes. Taiwan is in a position where the question about what China can do militarily becomes secondary to the question about how long the United States could sustain an effective military response. And the answer that the official American documentation provides is precise and unambiguous. Not long, before stockpiles run out, before resupply can arrive across contested oceans. What the documents reveal is more disturbing than any projection about Beijing. The United States does not need to wait until 2027 to be vulnerable. They already are. The window is not opening, it's closing. An army that cannot sustain combat for long enough may not be able to deter combat from starting. This story is not over. The stockpile reports required by the 2025 DECO and Yedi will start appearing. The implementation of distributed maritime operations will be tested against the timeline, and INDOPACOM commanders will continue to testify. Follow along. If what you heard here changed how you read the headlines about Taiwan, share it with those who need to understand what the numbers really say. Subscribe, because this channel will be here when the data arrives.